As discussed in previous videos, grafting was a part of Michela's many research branches. Now, given Godric's involvement with Michela's Grain Alliance, it's tempting to see him as having imparted that kind of knowledge to Michela. But the thing is, Godric doesn't seem to me like the smartest, most resourceful an individual can be. He's not exactly the picture of a demigod's best self, right? Not to mention that he's known as Godric the Grafted now, but he was still called Godric the Golden back when he fought against Malenia, judging by the sword inscription found around Stormveil's gatefront ruins. This means he wasn't yet grafted when he joined the Alliance, and was therefore, and not unexpectedly, a recipient of this knowledge rather than its source. But where did grafting come from then? Well, in my Chaos Conspiracy video, I mentioned the Champion Song painting, which was connected to Shabriri, who was himself connected to Michela. That painting depicts the Sainted Hero's grave, which stands right next to the Stormcaller Church, from where Michela would have kidnapped Vaika. Now, the hero's grave itself has a Black Knife assassin sitting at its doorstep, keeping in mind that these assassins had been tracking Michela. And inside of it, we can also find Revenants and the ancient Dragon Knight Kristoff ashes. Revenants have been previously connected to Michela not only by their lily-shaped wraith-calling bells, but also by the aforementioned researches I'd explained in my second Michela video. Regarding those spirit ashes, it is said that after the first defense of Leyndell, Kristoff earned the hero's honor of Erdtree Burial for the feat of capturing Godefroy the Grafted. The so-called first defense of Leyndell is described by a sword inscription that reads, "The first defense of Leyndell, a sovereign alliance rots from within. Traces yet remain of bloody conspiracy." The inscription implies a fight against Michela's alliance, right? Rots from within, bloody conspiracy. So, Kristoff having imprisoned Godefroy during said battle implies Godefroy was a member of that alliance, which foreshadows Godric's later involvement with the Prodigy twins. This indicates that, unlike Godric, Godefroy was not only already a member of Michela's alliance when Malenia came through Leyndell, he was already grafted. So, the implication, I believe, is that Godefroy had used the saints buried in the Sainted Hero's grave in the research that would have led to the creation of the cleric-like Revenants, which he'd have conducted in the name of Michela's Grain Alliance, and that ultimately allowed Godric the Golden to become as grafted as Godefroy was. Their faces look the same because they're closely related, possibly brothers, possibly twins. Godefroy wasn't a member of Leyndell's Sovereign Alliance because their branch of the family was already considered the bottom of the barrel, the runs of the leader, and he just wasn't high enough in the succession line. And their grafting looks the same because Godric being Godric, he's just copy-pasting the techniques passed down from Godefroy, up until the point where he gets a gross dragon head to stick his gross arm into. And I know a lot of people dismiss Godefroy as lazy devs reusing assets, but this should serve as a reminder that we shouldn't just dismiss stuff out of hand. Sometimes, shiny things means nothing, and sometimes, unassuming things hide actual lore. I had previously explained that scarlet rot spreads through spores that cover the landscape and infect living hosts. And I had also talked about the spirit mushrooms found next to Tolkien spirit NPCs and how they'd feature in Miquella's plans. But something I hadn't realized at the time is that these ghost shrooms appear everywhere. It doesn't matter how rot-infested or rot-free the location might be, they're simply everywhere. What this indicates is that scarlet rot itself is everywhere. You may not be able to see its effects yet, but everywhere and everyone is already infected. We're all already rotten dead. The cycles will continue until eternity. Scarlet rot will lay dormant but for a few outbreaks here and there, and then, one day, out of nowhere, the fungi apocalypse will just happen. It's as Gowry says, as I've aged, I found the best way to aid the young is to be forgotten. And this grim future isn't reserved for the lands between either. Rot seems to be a recent development in the Shadow Realm, given how spider scorpions were native to the realm of Shadow, but were far smaller in size, and how recent giant scorpions are said to trace back to the Church of the Bud. And, despite Rot's limited presence in that world, Shadow Realm spirit NPCs also have ghost shrooms around them, regardless of their location. Their apocalypse has also already happened. Now it's just waiting for the crescendo to sound off the last horn of the end days. And considering all the colonialist vibes found throughout this DLC, I gotta say that the Crusaders bringing Scarlet Rot to the Shadow Realm is eerily reminiscent of real life. I wonder if Run is bringing spores to outer space too. So, there are 3 primeval sorceries in the game: Comet Azure, Stars of Ruin, and Founding Rain of Stars. The first 2 were developed by Azure and Lusat respectively. Rain of Stars, on the other hand, is described as the eldest primeval sorcery, said to have been discovered by an ancient astrologer, which noticeably omits the name of its creator. Now, this being not just a primeval sorcery, but the eldest primeval sorcery, one would expect Rain of Stars to be explicitly associated with one of the Grand Masters, right? But both their crowns buff their respective spells, and neither of those crowns affect this one, indicating there's a third, very ancient primeval sorcerer who would have devised this particular spell instead, and I believe that to be Sellen. The first and most important piece of evidence here is that she actually gets to cast Rain of Stars during her fights, creating a direct and explicit connection between the two. Also, having been expelled from the academy, Sellen is a heretic, much like the sages and other sorcerers shunned by that institution. And the spell itself is found in the Heretical Rise, which is currently guarded by Academy marionettes, just like Selen's body. And yes, she's seen as this young prodigy student of the Academy, but remember that there's no telling how old any given Graven Mage might be, since they can just transfer the primal glintstone into another, younger body whenever they please. She's perceived as a prodigy because she's inhabiting the body of a young sorcerer, while carrying eons worth of accumulated knowledge. Meanwhile, the fact that Azur and Lusat are still known by their original identities means that they never changed bodies, which could explain the crystallization that overtook them, since their vessels would have been carrying crystals for as many lifetimes as Selen would have changed hers. Missionaries' cookbooks were made by a man who, unable to become a finger maiden, instead became a missionary and went forth to spread holy teachings. Is that a reference to a closeted trans person? And, given the similarity between the golden drawings in those cookbooks and the drawings Golden Mask died making on the ground, was that a reference to Gold Mask? He couldn't become a cute finger maiden, so he wiggles his finger instead? Farum Azula dogs have bling. There's no stated origin for the affliction of the Maneflies, but the description of the ailment talisman found in the alien village. Oddly, those who cared for the infected and made certain they were given a proper burial were never afflicted themselves. That raises some red flags to me. It is odd indeed that those exposed the most to the disease will never contract said disease. It's also odd that they'd be casting blood-fly incantations, not only because you'd expect healers to cast healing spells, but also because it's a bit uncouth to be weaponizing flies around the fly-related disease-ridden people you're supposed to be caring for. What it looks like to me is that the people supposedly taking care of the infected are the ones who were infecting them in the first place. I think that sounds pretty reasonable, but I have no more leads for the moment. This could possibly, maybe, perhaps, be another instance of Marika's pre-Crusade subterfuge, which I explained in the second part of the timeline videos, and which would fit with the pattern established by the game, right? But I haven't found any conclusive links there. Conversely, it could have something to do with Miquella, given his association with blood and the aforementioned blood-fly incantations, but I honestly don't see how that would work. Like I said, no more leads for now, we'll have to wait and see. There are 3 minor earth trees being cultivated in the Shadow Realm. One in the Shaman village, one inside the Shadow Keep, and another beneath the encampment in front of the keep. As previously stated, the Shadow Realm doesn't have an earth tree from which seeds could sprout naturally. Therefore, they have to have brought such seeds with them, meaning these minor ones are being cultivated. An interesting detail that might be related to them is the poison swamps found past the minor earth tree beneath the Shadow Keep, and another swamp on the path between Ensi's Castle and Ilak River. Perfumers are the botanists of the lands between, so it's no surprise that we find them looking after one of these trees, with a camp of perfumers right on top of them, overlooking the swamp. The blessed bone shards around that tree imply they could have been using the dead as fertilizer, and the Miranda flower we find there is also associated with perfumers being found in lakes, swamps, and the like, even though there are no such flowers in the swamp over yonder, you know? Like on the swamp, next to the tree, in front of the keep. But the swamp leading to Ilak River has no perfumers. And it has Mirandas, right? It's the inverse scenario. And it also has vulgar militiamen. The militiamen are a part of America's forces, are found guarding various places, and are said to also be found on battlefields. But apparently, there's nothing there to be guarded, and there are no signs of battle either. Well, if the perfumers harvest the Mirandas for their practice, then the lack of Miranda flowers below their encampment would imply those have already been harvested, given they're already looking after a minor earth tree there. And the presence of Mirandas on that other swamp would imply they simply haven't been harvested yet. That's the site of a future minor earth tree, and that's what the militiamen are guarding. When I talked about Miquela's researches, I drew a connection between the waters in the Spirit Color Cave and the ancestor spirits, and I mentioned the colors presented by both as one of the arguments. Well, the bone bow produces a color of the same hue, and considering said bow is a medium for spirit calling, then that bow helps to corroborate that connection. Fortisex's arena has, for lack of a better term, a very trippy sky. It literally looks like somebody painted an acid trip. And while it's reasonable to assume that's just on account of that fight taking place inside Godwin's Undying Nightmare, I think that may be reflective of something more literal. Like, the inside of Batswings have a pattern that looks just like that sky, so I think it's possible that's just how the sky looked during the era of the Glowmite Queen in the rule of the ancient dragons. Under that sky, the underside of those wings would serve as camouflage, allowing bats to hunt more efficiently, and the sky in Fortisex's arena would have been drawn from the memories of either Godwin and or Fortisex themselves. It's a sign of adaptive evolution, aptly disguised as a nonsense background art style. So another bit that I thought about here is that the Blessing of Despair ending, the Dung Eaters ending, also has the same kind of sky as Fortisex's arena, and I think that may be due to like I have theorized before that the Dung Eater may be kindred to the Leonine Misbegottens, and the Misbegottens are associated with the Age of the Crucible, which I had also theorized would have been the period of time ruled over by the Glowmite Queen and the Ancient Dragons. So I think that's the connection there. That's what the skybox of that ending means. Yeah. The Moor settlement has collapsed into itself, and given the context of falling stars that is prevalent in the game, one might be inclined to assume that's what caused the crater at its center. The problem with that is that there's no meteor at the bottom of the crater. Like, you know those mines in the lands between? They all have meteors at the bottom. The crater at Murph doesn't. Something else that seems strange to me is the tunnel dug between the crater and the well in Bonnie Village. It wouldn't make sense for them to randomly dig their way out of a crater straight to the well. So it must have been dug from Bonnie to Murph. If so, that makes the hole at the settlement not really a crater, but a cave-in. This could even be subtly hinted at by the Shattered Stone Talisman's mention of earthquakes. The question then would be, why they dug the tunnel to begin with? Well, as previously theorized, the greater potentates at Bonnie Village are likely non-Horn Sent people working for the Crusade. One possibility then is that they purposefully collapsed the village either during or in preparation for the invasion. But Murph isn't particularly defensible, and it's also caught between Castle Lances and the Shadow Keep, so there'd be little reason to take this approach over simply running them down with troops. In the end, I think it's more likely the people condemned to be pickled into jars dug the tunnel to try and reach the nearby settlement in an attempt to escape their fate, and met with an end just as deadly, but arguably less gruesome. Academy balloons are made of dragon's wings. Go figure. Godfrey's people were the Highland warriors of the Shadow Realm. Memory of Grace says, the memory of first grace, which once guided bygone tarnish to the lands between, implying they originally came from outside the lands between, just like the Newman. Also, the Highland axe is placed in front of Godway's portrait in Stormveil. The Highland warrior set's color pattern can arguably set the precedent for the crimson and navy hoods donned by later Tarnished, and while Highland warriors were hunters of bears, Godfrey literally kinda fights like one, right? Claw-shaped hands, cross-pattern swipes, lunge attacks, grab attacks, roar of Rugalei attacks, two hands on the ground earthshake attacks. There can be only one Elden Lord at a time, Serosh notwithstanding. For the most part, when you use the coffin at the Great Waterfall Basin, a stream of red runes lights the way and takes you upward to the nameless Eternal City. This is an admittedly strange mode of transportation, but no stranger than anything else we've seen in-game. The thing that piques my interest, though, is the unassuming color pattern at display here. Eternal City's related magic and technology have a very distinct color palette associated with them, and red does not feature in that spectrum. But then we have to remind ourselves that the Nox had been banished underground. These places may be called cities, but they are effectively concentration camps and a direct transportation system, allowing its prisoners to commute between camps isn't entirely compatible with that concept, right? That's not how camps work. You don't let the prisoners go where they please. If we remove the coffins from the equation though, coming from the surface would be the only way of reaching underground eternal cities, which would be much more befitting of this scenario, since it would allow the surface dwellers who had banished the Nox to control their movements. So, the implication is that the coffins were a kind of underground railroad that allowed collaboration between the Nox of different cities in their uprising against the surface dwellers. And we have an example of a red-hued influence on display down there as well, amidst the facsimile night sky of the Nox, with the Bloodstar's presence in Mohgwyn Palace, which can be seen from a distance. And this, of course, ties back to my theories that the shamans, henceforth known as the Newman, had come to the Eternal Cities from the Shadow Realm, along with the Formless Mother, and assisted the Nox in their rebellion, giving us a point of origin for this otherwise aberrant display of rune technology. So, there's a bunch of misbegotten in Haligtree Town, and a couple of them are kinda praying to Miquella statues, so it's naturally assumed they work for Miquella, right? And that sets the template for the misbegotten we find in the consecrated snowfield and the ones we find in Leyndell too, since they're on the path leading to the Grand Liftoff Road, meaning they likely came to Leyndell with Malenia's forces and were left behind. And then the DLC also gave us the manifestation of a misbegotten crusader in the Stone Coffin Fissure, who drops a Miquella spell, which kinda confirms all of that, right? Yeah, well, no. Like, the Haligtree Town is the only place in Elphael with signs of actual battle, and all the nobles who live there are all dead, which makes it look like the misbegotten didn't live in that town, that they were invading it. Then there's the misbegotten in Leyndell, who are being tended to by Leyndell perfumers, which could imply they were actually working for Leyndell too, right? Like, the perfumers are known to care for that kind of people, but the implication is still there, that the misbegotten in that ash-covered path were defending Leyndell instead of invading it, right? This is reinforced by the misbegotten stationed at the fringes of the Leyndell forces in Altos Plateau, in the vicinity of the Omen, who also worked for them, and this, in turn, makes the Crusader in the Snowfield make a little more sense to me, since his legendary weapon is so blatantly connected to the Golden Order rather than Miquella's forces, meaning that's in fact the group he worked for. And the DLC Crusader wields an iron greatsword instead of a Golden Order greatsword, and the description of the spell he drops says that it was cultivated by a tradition separate from Golden Order fundamentalism, very explicitly setting it and the Crusader that holds it apart from the Golden Order. The DLC Crusader works for Miquella. The other three groups don't. So I had something at the end here about how the misbegotten in Elphael may have been charmed after they attacked the Haligtree Town, because the misbegotten there, they don't fight the Haima sorcerers stationed there, but then I looked more closely at the Misbegotten in front of the Miquela statues, and the Leonines, they don't pray, right? But there's one kneeled in front of a Miquela statue, and that's more ambiguous because he could be kneeling in front of the statue, or there's the body of a dead noble there, so he might just be looking at his victim. And the other one, the regular Misbegotten, the winged one, that I had in my mind the impression that he was praying, but he's not. Like, they have a very distinct praying animation pose, and that one in front of the statue just isn't. He's like shaking, like the ones that you find in Mourn, around the area where they were tortured. So, and that's the only one in Yophael that's doing that. And that's the one that's close to the Haima sorcerers. So I'm guessing they don't fight the Haima sorcerers because they were beaten into submission by big clubs and glintstone mallets. I don't know. So yeah, there's that too. Okay, back to it now. So, guardian lions have omen-like horns. Given Marika, Godfrey, and Serosh were fresh out of the classical era, aka the rule of the Glomite Queen, aka the age of the Crucible when they stepped up and into a position of power, it is reasonable for these beasts to share in this aspect of the Crucible. But, given Marika mothered omen children with Godfrey, and since Serosh seems to always hang around with them, I also can't help but to wonder whether she mothered omen-like cubs with Serosh too. And like no shame whatsoever is being cast here, Serosh is a sentient creature, he can make his own choices. I really wanna make that very clear. I just wanna know whether she was a furry or not. According to my theories, the Newmen are the shamans who relocated from the Shadow Realm to the Eternal Cities, and married into the bloodline from which Marika is descended. And Rogier's dialogue helps to corroborate that with the line, "They say the Black Knife assassins who carried out the deed were scions of the Eternal Cities." Ghost Flame Breath says that the land of spirit graves is home to all manner of dead, and even the corpses of fallen dragons found their way there. Several of them were endowed with such vivacity that even in death they could not fully die. Which is, of course, a reference to Ghost Flame dragons. But there are two problems here. Like, why dragons and why here? We do find the likes of those who live in death wandering around other locations, such as the Jagged Peak, but there are no other types of skeletons strolling through the land of spirit graves, other than the Ghost Flame Dragon. So, this area doesn't necessitate undeath, and dragons themselves don't naturally lend themselves to undeath as well, since there are no Ghost Flame Dragons either in the lands between, where a literal war was waged against their kind, or the relatively close Jagged Peak, where Baal's dead offspring cover the mountainsides. Well, the most likely explanation is that the description of Ghost Flame Breath amounts to nothing more than popular belief, and that Ghost Flame Dragons are an unintentional byproduct of burning dragon corpses with Ghost Flame. In the lands between, there was no reason for the citizens of the Eternal Cities to have burned the immortal ancient dragons since, well, they were immortal and wouldn't just drop dead. While their future fallen brethren killed during Marika's war wouldn't be burning Ghost Flame since, well, Marika just wouldn't do that, right? In the Shadow Realm, however, a Ghost Flame cult had been manufactured by Marika, as I have explained in the timeline videos, which explains the presence of Ghost Flame birth Ghost Flame dragons in the areas where they can be found, while also explaining their absence in Jagged Peak, since there are no signs of Hornsent having settled there who could burn them in Ghost Flame. Marika waged war against the Ancient Dragons when Placido Sax was Elden Lord. Bayle and his Drakes also waged war against the Ancient Dragons when Placido Sax was Elden Lord. During those wars, some Ancient Dragons defected to Leyndell, namely Lanceax and Fortisax, while others defected to Bayle, namely Senesax, who is currently chilling at the Jagged Peak eating Drake Warrior wannabes instead of flying them to the top and helping them with the fight against Bayle the Dread, as Placido Sax had commanded. An overlap seems to be implied there, which could also be corroborated by the overlap between the presence of Marika's Crusade and Bayle in the Shadow Realm at the same time, hinting at a relatively close timeline at the very least. And these don't have to have been two separate wars, right? No such thing is ever stated by the game. In fact, I believe these to have been a single conflict where Marika and Bayle joined forces to depose Placido Sax and the Gloamite Queen. An ancient dragon knight who followed Godwyn's Golden Knights into the realm of shadow even left records related to the crafting of red lightning pots, which state that the ancient dragons who betrayed their lord to side with a tyrant were known for wielding branching red lightning, further connecting Bayle to Marika, two tyrants seeking to usurp power from the same rulers. I wonder if she promised him a seat at her table as the new Elden Lord? Anyway, according to my theories, Marika had used Deathblight as a weapon against Farum Azula and effectively poisoned the ancient dragons with grace, causing Placido Sax to vomit golden flames, for instance, quote-unquote vomit, which are described as his dying wails. In the end, Grace was the Dragon's Lord ruin. This would mean that when Bayle fought against Placido Sax, he was already fighting the Dragon Lord's diminished form, which in turn would mean that when we beat Placido Sax, we're fighting the twice diminished version of a crippled reclusive recovering from a biological attack. Go Tarnished. And then there's also Dragon Communion, which was kind of a big mystery at first, but then the DLC kind of gave us a fairly complete explanation of what that was all about, right? Placido Sax recruited humans to fight Bayle. Okay. That also explains why we get dragon hearts from drakes but not from ancient dragons. Got it. Now, the first thing to notice here is that while Fortisax is a Dragon Communion priestess, Lanceax was a priestess of the ancient dragon cult. As previously explained, Marika had recruited a bunch of the Gloamite Queen's Dragon Knights into her ranks, which is implied by the Banished Knight sets stored both in Leyndell and the Round Table Hold, and also by one of Marika's speeches relayed to us by Melina, and as a part of the assimilation process, the previous beliefs of these Dragon Knights were integrated into the Golden Order in the form of the Ancient Dragon cult, which arose in Leyndell after the War of the Ancient Dragons. As per the Dragon Cult prayer book, which was itself, the Dragon Cult in Leyndell was itself an extension of the original Ancient Dragon cult that existed in Farum Azula, as per the Ancient Dragon prayer book, a lost tome that never reached the lands between. So, the Dragon Knights who sided with Leyndell don't use Dragon Communion spells and seals because they didn't fight against Bayo, whom we have just theorized would have sided with Marika as well. Meanwhile, some of the Dragon Knights who remained loyal to Placido Sax used Dragon Communion spells and seals because Placido Sax had commanded them to fight Bayo. And they were also banished to the fringes after the fall of their Dragon Lord. And along those same lines, we also have the Rock Heart, which boosts Dragon Communion spells, and the Priestess Heart, which boosts Dragon Code spells. The Rock Heart works with Communion spells because it was used in Dragon Communion. That's the purpose of that heart, to help Drake warriors hunt Bayo down. And the Priestess Heart doesn't work with Communion spells because by the time she gives it to you, the hunt for Bayo is already over. The Tyrant is already dead. So it works with Dragon Code spells instead. Keeping in mind, Florisax herself uses Red Lightning, which is consistent with the Farum Azula variant of the Dragon Code, but since the later code is just a continuation of the previous one, her heart works for spells of the later code as well. And lastly, those two special hearts also give us the reason why Lanceax defected in the first place. Despite their differences, the Priestess Heart is also a rock heart. The Japanese description even uses the same kanji for both. And the difference in their appearance is easily explained by hers being fresh and the other one being really fucking old. Now, the interesting bit here is that, as we've mentioned before, you're only supposed to get Dragon Hearts by killing drakes, which is corroborated by Florisax. Since her heart cannot be taken, it must be given. So, Rock Heart indicates that ancient dragons surrendering their hearts for Dragon Communion used to be a thing. And since Dragon Communion was instituted by Placido Sax, then giving up their hearts must have been a top-down decision as well. So, Lanceax didn't break faith out of ideology, she did it out of a survival instinct. Placido Sax told her to die, and she replied, "Fuck you." Instead of actually falling asleep, Florisax is in the habit of going to a state of trance, from which she offers some kind of unspecified solace to her Dragon Lord Placido Sax. So, what's up with that? Well, as just discussed, I believe Marika to have deployed Deathblight as a chemical weapon against Farum Azula. And there's another sleep/dragon/blight scenario that sets an interesting precedent for this situation. Furtisax and Godwyn. The Leech Dragon currently fights Deathblight inside Godwyn's nightmares, and I think Florisax is doing the same thing for Placido Sax. You know, since he was also poisoned with Deathblight, I guess, as I have guessed before. And do you know how you can use sleep pots to break the Nox's control over the giant ants in Oxtella? You know, an instance of sleep breaking mind connections? Well, if we give Thiolier's industrial-grade sleep medicine to Florisex, that fucks her up because, likewise, that breaks her connection to her death blight-afflicted Dragon Lord chilling at the heart of the storm beyond time. Starting with the usual disclaimer that I'm definitely not fluent in Japanese. Fluent. I'd like to go back to the topic of the rock heart in order to clarify some mistranslations. The English description says, heart consumed in the ancient original form of Dragon Communion. The first problem there is the word consumed, which is, in fact, pure fabrication. The Japanese description simply doesn't have that word in it. And that's a problem because consuming the heart creates an in-game inconsistency, since unlike regular dragon hearts, we don't actually eat this one. Then there's the word original. In Japanese, the rock heart is described as an old model or prototype, which makes ancient inept description, but original means first, right? It adds a kind of specificity that just isn't present in the original text, and that can create some confusion when trying to work out the lore there. Next, the last paragraph says, the last thing the partaker saw with human eyes was a sunset, its colors faded and tarnished, a remote thing from eternity. And the problems I have with this part of the translation are a bit nitpicky. Like, they don't really affect the meaning of the description lore-wise, it's mostly the phrasing, but I promise there's a reason for me to be mentioning this, okay? Okay, so, while the English version has the colors fading from the sunset, the original has the colors fading from the whole landscape. And also, the quote should probably have been translated in the first person. And then there's that last phrase there, a remote thing from eternity. The English description is saying that either the sunset or its colors are a distant thing. The M dash makes me inclined to think it's talking about the sunset before its colors faded, and the word eternity is used to punctuate how distant the object of this phrase is from the Drake warrior. Right? Distant in time. Now, the kanji translated as eternity also have the meaning of immortality, which I think makes more sense structurally given the phrasing in Japanese, and the M dash that you see in the English version isn't something they took from the Japanese description. That's just a choice they made. So, when you extract the game files, this is what the description looks like. There's no dash there, there's just a space, and in-game, that space becomes a line break that looks like this. Okay? Now, for comparison, this is what the Japanese text dump description of the Omen Baron looks like. Here, again, the space becomes a line break in-game, but this time, instead of interpreting these as two phrases united by an M dash, they chose to interpret the space as a period and divide the two phrases into individual sentences. There's also Memory of Grace, for instance. There's a section there with a single period in Japanese, but they use two periods in English. This isn't all cut and dry. These are choices that they're making, and I just happen to disagree with the choice of using an M dash there with the rock heart. So, personally, I'd remove that em dash, make that phrase its own sentence, and translate it as something like immortality was something far away. That last little bit there. This adds a meaning that is missing in English, that being the motivation for the Drake warrior to have partook in Dragon Communion, which would have been the desire to attain the immortality of the ancient dragons, which is in and of itself a common motif in Soulsborne games. In the end, I think that Rockhart's description could read something like, as a human, the last scene I saw was in a red sunset, but everything faded. Immortality was far away. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this, well, I don't know if you've ever read any Japanese poetry, but I think this description kinda reads like a Japanese death poem, a jisei, like the wandering artist paints the landscapes seen during the last moments of those welcomed into death's embrace. Right? And since we're in this subject, I think Egon was actually on a quest to obtain and consume a rock heart, so he could become the most metal man who has ever lived. This isn't canon, this is headcanon, but I choose to believe it with all my heart.
There is life in me yet! I will soon feast upon your heart! Mark my words! You too shall know fear!
Sinclair Law, Balam, Real Vampire, Sandy, Hoover, Taylor Reed, Medium Hat Logan, Derp, The Foe, Brain Douche, Mr. Pudding, Kyle Van Ripper, and Tom Sparks.
With a hail of harpoons! With every last drop of my being! You shall haunt me no longer!